To be born an heiress in America is to be handed a fortune nobody intends for you to keep. The vault has your name on the door, but every key belongs to someone else. The lawyer, the husband, the doctor, the accountant, the trustee, the cousin who says he loves you, the nurse who says she understands you, the country club where your father once danced. They are all already in the room, and they are all waiting. 3 women learned this in the cruelest way possible. They inherited millions, they died with nothing, and nobody alive can explain where the money went. If you find yourself drawn to the stories America's society columns once buried, the kind of stories that only survive because a few quiet women remembered them, subscribe so the next one finds you the moment it goes live. Chapter 1. The 5-year-old worth $1 million. In 1917, when Barbara Hutton was 5 years old, the newspapers gave her a name she did not choose and would never escape. They called her the $1 Million Baby. She had inherited nothing yet. Her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, the founder of the F.W. Woolworth retail chain, was still living, and he would not die for another 2 years. Her father, Franklin Laws Hutton, the New York investment banker who had co-founded E.F. Hutton, was building his own empire on Wall Street. Barbara herself, in 1917, was a child in a smock dress sitting for a society photographer in a Manhattan studio. None of that mattered. The papers had decided who she was, and the country agreed. A year earlier, in 1916, Barbara had been 4 years old and asleep in a connecting room at the Plaza Hotel when her mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, was found dead. The hotel called it an accidental overdose. The presumed cause was strychnine or a barbiturate. The family rearranged the story for the papers and arranged the rest for itself, but the inside of the family knew. Edna had been left alone too often. Franklin had been openly with other women. The marriage had collapsed inside the plaza years before the death itself. The child in the connecting room was the witness the family could not erase. Franklin remarried within a year. He sent Barbara to live with her grandmother, Jenny Creighton Woolworth, at the Creighton Mansion, then to boarding schools in California and Switzerland. She was treated by her own father as a tax problem and an account number. The strategy he employed, growing her inheritance to such a size that by her 21st birthday it would have compounded to the equivalent of $900 million in modern currency, was a strategy. It was not love. It was a plan in which she happened to be the central figure. The $1 Million Baby christening did one thing that no later event in her life could ever undo. It removed her interior privacy before she was old enough to understand what privacy was. From the age of 5 forward, Barbara Hutton was a public sum. She would walk into a hotel lobby in Paris at 21, and the front desk would already know what she was worth, in pounds sterling, in francs, and in headlines. She would sit at a Russian Orthodox wedding altar in 1933, and the photographers would know what her dress had cost in dollars and what the necklace at her throat had cost in pounds. She would die in a hotel suite in Los Angeles in 1979, and the obituaries would still lead with the dollar figure she had been given at birth. By 1930, the Great Depression had pulled the floor out from under most of America, and the contrast between Barbara Hutton's life and the life of the country had become impossible to ignore. Her father threw her debut at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel on Madison Avenue at a reported cost of $60,000. Maurice Chevalier sang. Rudy Vallee played. The press was let in for 2 specific hours and then locked out for the rest of the night. Outside Woolworth stores in cities across the country, children stood at the windows with hand-lettered signs reading, "Babs eats while we starve." There is a photograph of one of them, somewhere in a Cleveland archive, that captures the entire structure of her life in a single frame. A boy of about 8, missing one shoe, standing on the sidewalk in front of a 5 and dime, holding a sign with her name on it. He had never met her. He never would. He was not protesting Barbara herself. He was protesting the country that had named her at 5. The Hutton estate had built a fortune by selling household goods 5 cents at a time. Frank Woolworth had been a clerk in a dry goods store in Watertown, New York in 1873, when he conceived the idea of a store where every item cost 5 cents. He opened the first one in Utica in 1879. It failed. He opened the second in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, later that year, and that one did not fail. By 1901, he had 390 stores. By his death in 1919, he had over 1,000 and was building a 60-story tower on Lower Broadway, the Woolworth Building, that for over a decade was the tallest building in the world. The fortune was assembled out of nickels. Barbara would spend it the way a country spends a war, but she did not know that yet. She was 5 years old in 1917, and they were already calling her the $1 Million Baby. Chapter 2. The birthday that made her richer still. The party at the Ritz-Carlton cost $60,000 and was attended by Maurice Chevalier, while children outside Woolworth stores held signs that read what no Ritz guest would say aloud. Barbara was 19 years old that night. She had 2 years left before the inheritance officially landed in her hands. Her father was rehearsing the transfer the way a Broadway producer rehearses an opening. He had been growing the principal for 16 years. He had moved it through trust vehicles, through Wall Street partnerships, through the firm he had co-founded, E.F. Hutton. By her 21st birthday on November 14, 1933, the principal would stand at approximately $42 million in 1933 currency. In modern terms, after inflation, the figure most often cited is around $900 million. A few biographers have put the peak as high as $1 billion. The exact peak does not matter. What matters is that on the morning of her 21st birthday, Barbara Hutton became, by every reasonable measure, the richest unmarried woman in the world. The transfer carried no protective conditions. There was no spendthrift trust, the kind of structure that would have prevented her from giving the principal away to creditors or husbands. There was no requirement that she sign a prenuptial agreement before marrying. There was no continuing trustee with veto authority over major disbursements. The money was handed to her absolutely. The men around her, her father, her lawyers, her bankers, had all agreed that this was the most generous, most modern, and most American way to hand a fortune to a young woman. They were wrong about all three things. The men around her also had reasons to want the structure that way. Her father had remarried in 1917 and built his life around a new family. Once Barbara controlled her own money, his obligations to her, financial and emotional, were complete. Her lawyer, Graham Madison, who would represent her in some capacity for almost 40 years, gained an exceptionally lucrative client whose decisions he would influence repeatedly, without any independent fiduciary check on his recommendations. The advisors around her benefited from her freedom. The freedom itself was the bait in the trap. 6 months before the inheritance landed, Barbara had met a young Georgian prince in Paris. His name was Alexis Mdivani. He was 28 years old. He carried a title from a small Georgian principality that had not technically existed for over a century, but the title was real enough in 1933 to be worth, in society pages, more than a passport from any republic. Alexis came from a family the Paris press called the marrying Mdivanis. His siblings had been making strategic marriages to American heiresses across the previous decade. The strategy was a family enterprise, openly discussed in salons from Biarritz to the Rue de Rivoli. Barbara wanted the title. She wanted the wedding photographs in Vogue. She wanted, more than anything else, to be a person rather than a sum. And she had decided that a princess, even a Georgian one, was a person in a way a Woolworth heiress had not yet been allowed to be. Alexis wanted the money. They were married on June 22, 1933, at the Russian Orthodox Cathedral on the Rue Daru, in the 8th arrondissement of Paris. Her wedding dress reportedly cost $50,000. Cartier supplied a jade necklace, gifted by her father, valued at $55,000. 500 guests attended the reception at the Ritz. The photographs ran on the front page of every major American newspaper for 3 days. On the morning of the wedding, Alexis received from her a settlement reported at approximately $1 million in cash. This was not a dowry in the medieval sense. It was the price of his name. The papers all over Paris and New York knew the figure within 48 hours of the wedding. Nobody pretended it was anything else. 2 years later, the marriage collapsed. Alexis received another settlement, reported around $1 million again, on his exit. He died in a car crash in Spain in 1935, 2 months after the divorce, driving a Rolls-Royce Barbara had given him. He was 29 years old. The Mdivani share of her inheritance, paid in cash, jewelry, and real estate, was estimated at the time at around $2.5 million over the full span of the marriage and its exit. In modern currency, somewhere around $57 million paid to a young man who had been married to her for less than 2 years and who was now dead. The lawyers shrugged. The press in 1935 blamed her judgment. Nobody asked the obvious structural question. They would not ask it for the next 40 years because they would never have to. The pattern that had begun on her wedding day was about to repeat 6 more times. Each time, it would cost her more. Each time, the press would describe it as her decision. Each time, the structure would do precisely what it was designed to do. Chapter 3: The 7 Husbands and the Vanishing Fortune. She married 7 times, and only one of those men, Cary Grant, refused to take a single dollar from her. The remaining 6 husbands collected in cash settlements, alimony, real estate transfers, jewelry, and other gifts, sums that biographers have estimated in aggregate at somewhere between 30 and 50 million 1970s dollars, which is to say, a substantial multiple of that in modern currency. The exact figure has never been calculable, because Barbara herself rarely kept records, and her lawyers were not eager to produce them in detail after her death. Husband number 2 was Count Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlow, a Danish nobleman who courted Barbara in 1935, 6 weeks after the Mimdevani divorce. They married on the 27th of May, 1935. He moved her to Denmark for tax purposes, and she gave birth there in 1936 to her only child, a son named Lance Reventlow. When the marriage collapsed in 1941 in the middle of the Second World War, Reventlow secured a Danish protective custody arrangement for Lance that ensured the boy, and a substantial trust, would remain inside European jurisdiction. The fight cost Barbara, in legal fees and supplemental settlements, sums she never disclosed. Lance would later become a Formula racing driver, design and build the only American Formula One car ever to start a Grand Prix, the Scarab, and die in a private plane crash in Colorado in 1972 at the age of 36. Barbara did not recover from that death. Nobody who knew her thought she would. Husband number 3 was the only one the historical record exonerates. Cary Grant married her on July 8, 1942, at the home of his friend Frank Vincent in Lake Arrowhead, California. They were divorced on August 30, 1945. Grant took nothing. He paid for his own restaurants. He bought his own suits. He returned to her every piece of jewelry he had received as a gift. He told friends afterward that the marriage had failed not because of money, but because Barbara was unable to be private with another human being, and he was unable to live publicly. He continued to call her on her birthday for the rest of her life. Husband number 4 was Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian aristocrat she married in March 1947. He was a serious amateur racing driver. He drove a Delahaye coupe in the 1948 Monte Carlo rally on tires Barbara had paid for. The marriage ended in 1950. Trubetskoy received an exit settlement reported at $500,000 and a Paris apartment. Husband number 5 was Porfirio Rubirosa, the Dominican diplomat, racing driver, and professional husband. He had previously been married to 2 other heiresses, including Doris Duke. He married Barbara in Palm Beach on December 30th, 1953. He left her on February 20th, 1954, after 53 days. The financial terms of the exit were unusually well documented because Rubirosa, unlike the other husbands, treated them as a kind of joke. He took with him, by various contemporaneous accounts, alimony estimated at $2.5 million in cash, a separate settlement reported at $3.5 million, a converted B-25 bomber aircraft she had purchased for him, a string of polo ponies, and a coffee plantation in the Dominican Republic. A 1954 issue of Time magazine ran the figure as $5.5 million total. The marriage had lasted 53 days. Husband number 6 was Baron Gottfried von Kram, a former tennis champion she had known for decades. They married on November 8, 1955. The Baron was discreet, kind, and homosexual, which Barbara had known when she married him. The marriage was less a sexual partnership than a friendship under a family name. They divorced amicably in 1960. Kram took no documented settlement, although he did receive several substantial gifts during the marriage. He died in a car crash in Egypt in 1976. Husband number 7 was Pierre Raymond Doan, also known by various dynastic names, a French-Vietnamese chemical engineer she met in Tangier. They married on April 7, 1964, in Cuernavaca, Mexico, by which time Barbara was 51 years old, weighed less than 90 pounds, was on regular opiate, amphetamine, and barbiturate prescriptions from a rotating panel of personal physicians, and was selling jewelry at intervals to maintain her households in Tangier, Cuernavaca, and the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. The financial extractions during these 40 years were not extraordinary individually. Most of the husbands took settlements that were, by the standards of celebrity divorce in the period, in line with prevailing alimony norms. What was structurally extraordinary was the cumulative pattern. There were no advisors with the standing or independence to discipline her choices. Her lawyer Graham Madison, who handled her affairs in some capacity from the 1940s through the 1970s, was later accused by biographer Dean Jennings and others of self-dealing and questionable investment strategies, including overseas placements and speculative private ventures that depleted the estate without producing returns commensurate with the risks. Madison denied the allegations. The marriages were the public symptom. The private syndrome was that the only people Barbara could trust to be in the room with her were people whose income depended on her continued cooperation. The fortune did not vanish because she chose 7 bad husbands. It vanished because the architecture around her had no structural mechanism by which any choice she made could ever be moderated by anyone whose financial interests were independent of hers. Every advisor, every spouse, every doctor, every secretary was, in some structural sense, on the take. It was not corruption. It was simply how the system had been built. The marriages were not the cause. They were the symptom. The cause was the architecture itself. Chapter 4. The Copper King's Daughter Who Disappeared. When her father, William Andrews Clark, died in 1925, he left $200 million and a daughter who would spend the rest of her life pretending the money was not there. Huguette Marcelle Clark was 18 years old when her father died. She had been born on June 9, 1906, in Paris, in the 8th-floor villa her father had taken near the Champs-Élysées. He was 67 years old at her birth. Her mother, Anna LaChapelle Clark, his second wife, had been 40 years younger than him at their marriage. Huguette was already, by the conventions of her era, the daughter of an old man. By the time she finished finishing school, she would also be the daughter of a dead one. William Andrews Clark had been one of the dominant figures of the American Gilded Age in a generation that included John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Henry Clay Frick. Clark was the man none of them respected. He had built his fortune in the copper mines of Butte, Montana in the 1870s and 1880s, then in railroads, then in smelters in Arizona and copper electrolysis plants in New Jersey, then in banks, sugar plantations, banking interests in California, and eventually in newspapers and timber. By 1907, he had been elected to the United States Senate from Montana in an election so openly corrupt that the Senate refused to seat him on the first attempt. He was eventually seated. Mark Twain called him the most disgusting creature the American Republic had thus far produced. Clark did not appear to mind. The fortune he left at his death in March 1925 was conservatively valued at $200 million in 1925 currency. In modern money, the figure is around $3 billion. He had 4 surviving children from his first marriage, several of whom had been brought up in the spectacular house at 962 Fifth Avenue at the corner of 77th Street, a building of 121 rooms and 4 art galleries that was the largest private residence in New York City at the time of its construction. The mansion took 9 years to build, from 1906 to 1915, and was demolished only 12 years later, in 1927. The bulk of the fortune was divided between the children of the first marriage. Huguette and her older sister Andrée and her mother Anna received a smaller share. Andrée died of meningitis at 16 in 1919, leaving Huguette as the sole child of the second marriage. After William's death, Huguette and Anna moved out of the Fifth Avenue mansion, which Clark had directed in his will should be sold to settle taxes, and into a 12th-floor apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue, also overlooking Central Park. Over the next 60 years, Huguette would gradually acquire the 8th floor as well, until her apartment occupied 2 floors and roughly 42 rooms and represented one of the largest privately held residences in Manhattan. Huguette's first and only marriage took place in 1928. The husband was William MacDonald Gower, a Princeton graduate and son of a finance executive she had known since childhood. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. She filed for divorce in Reno, Nevada, in 1930. The grounds were given as desertion. Multiple later accounts have suggested the marriage was never consummated. The family interpreted the divorce as a failed experiment with normal life. Huguette gave no public statements then or later. She returned to the apartment at 907, returned to her mother, returned to her painting and her dolls, and never married again. She studied painting seriously. She took lessons in New York from the Japanese-American painter Tadeusz Stajka, who had also painted her father's portrait. She submitted works to exhibitions under her own name and several pseudonyms, including the simple alias H. Marcel. A few of her canvases survive in their private collections. She painted in oils, in watercolor, and occasionally in pastels. She painted the long, quiet light coming off the East River in late afternoon, the kind of light that makes a Manhattan apartment look briefly like a French village. She also began, in the 1930s, the doll collection that would eventually become one of the largest privately held collections of antique French and Japanese dolls in the world. She paid commercial workshops in Paris and Kyoto to construct miniature replicas of buildings to scale, complete with working light fittings, hand-woven carpets, and accurate period furniture. She acquired dolls in original costumes, some of them dating to the early 19th century. She corresponded with doll restorers in Geneva and Brussels. The dolls were not toys. They were the architecture of a world she could control. By her 40th birthday in 1946, she had withdrawn substantially from public life. By her 50th birthday in 1956, she had stopped visiting Bellosguardo, the family's 23-acre Santa Barbara estate, which she would never visit again. By her 60th birthday, she had stopped almost all visits with the surviving members of her father's first family. By her 70th, she communicated almost exclusively by telephone. By her 80th, she had begun the final retreat that would carry her into Beth Israel Medical Center. She was, by every available account, kind. The staff who served her loved her. The friends she retained adored her. She remembered birthdays. She paid for educations and houses and surgeries. She kept her father's Senate desk in her apartment. She read 3 newspapers a day. She was not unhappy. She was simply, quietly vanishing by a method that left the fortune perfectly preserved at the moment when other people would learn how to reach it. $300 million accumulated quietly through the 1960s and 70s and 80s. The Standard Oil dividends came in. The Manhattan real estate appreciated. The Bellosguardo estate held its value. Huguette herself ordered the curtains drawn in rooms she would never re-enter, and the fortune behind those curtains continued to grow. Chapter 5, 42 rooms, and nobody inside. For decades she paid the taxes, paid the staff, and ordered the curtains drawn at homes she would never visit again. The Bellosguardo estate sat on 23 acres of cliff above the Pacific in Santa Barbara, California. The main house contained 35 rooms. The original property had been purchased by William Clark in 1923 and rebuilt and expanded by Anna Clark through the 1930s. Huguette inherited it. She last visited in the early 1950s. From then until her death in 2011, the house was maintained as if she might return tomorrow. The staff at Bellosguardo continued to receive instructions by mail and telephone. Curtains were ordered for windows she would never look out of. Pianos were tuned for hands she would never play with. A 1937 Cadillac sedan sat in the garage and was started periodically to keep the engine in working order. The house itself was kept at the temperature she preferred. The cook prepared simple meals each day that the staff ate themselves because Huguette was not coming. The bills came monthly. Huguette paid them. She had purchased Le Beau Chateau, a 22-room country house in New Canaan, Connecticut, in 1951. She paid $175,000 for it. The estate sat on 52 acres of woodland. It was meant to be a country retreat from Manhattan summers. She never spent a single night in it. From 1951 until her estate sold the property after her death, Le Beau Chateau was maintained, heated in winter, gardened in spring, by a permanent staff who never met the owner. The cumulative cost of maintaining the unused property, including insurance, taxes, staff salaries, utilities, and repairs, was estimated by reporters after her death at well over $15 million across 60 years. The Fifth Avenue apartment was the only one of her properties she actually lived in, although the word lived is itself an approximation for what she did there. She occupied a small set of rooms in the larger apartment, kept the rest of it dust-covered and dark, and worked on her dolls and her painting in the afternoons. She slept in a single bed in a small room. She ate light meals brought to her by the cook. She wrote checks. She paid the staff. She kept the windows of the unused rooms covered. The miniature buildings she commissioned arrived from Paris and Kyoto in custom shipping crates. They were unpacked by staff and arranged in dedicated rooms of the apartment. The roofs lifted off to show the interiors. The wallpaper was hand-painted. The chandeliers were wired with low-voltage filaments that actually lit when she pressed a button at the base. There were models of French country estates she had visited as a child with her mother, Japanese tea houses she had visited never, Italian palazzos, English manor houses. She paid the workshops directly, often in installments of $40,000 or $50,000 per building. Across her lifetime, the doll collection accumulated to over 1,200 individual dolls, with associated miniature furniture and architectural pieces. After her death, the collection would be valued at well over $15 million at auction. Sotheby's would eventually sell substantial portions of it across 2 specialized sales. Inside her painting practice, she became increasingly skilled across the 1940s and 50s. She studied with Tadeusz Stajka until his death in 1954, then continued on her own. Her surviving canvases show a careful, controlled, somewhat melancholy attention to interior spaces and to elderly portraits. She painted her mother repeatedly. She painted her dolls. She painted a window with snow falling outside it. She did not paint people who were still alive. By the late 1960s, her wealth had compounded into a structure most observers, including her advisors, did not fully understand. The trust her father had created paid out steady dividends from Standard Oil holdings, Anaconda Copper holdings, and Northern Pacific Railroad holdings. Manhattan real estate appreciated through the long post-war bull market. The apartment alone, once she had acquired both floors, was worth $10 to $15 million by the 1970s and would eventually sell for close to $30 million. The Bellosguardo property held its value as Santa Barbara became more desirable. By the time the 1990s arrived, her remaining estate was estimated at around $300 million in liquid and illiquid assets combined. She had never traveled internationally after 1968. She had not been photographed in public since the early 1930s. She rarely accepted phone calls from outside a small circle of friends, godchildren, and staff. The press, which had been intermittently curious about her for decades, had largely lost interest. There were no scandalous photographs. There were no leaked letters. There was, from the outside, only an apartment with curtains drawn and a fortune that nobody seemed to be spending. The dollhouse was the metaphor for the life she actually wanted. A small world she could control. Furniture that did not move unless she moved it. Lights that came on when she pressed the switch. People who did not require her to perform a self she had never been allowed to choose. The life inside the dollhouses was the life she could not have inside the world the inheritance had given her. So she gave herself, every afternoon, a small world that worked the way she wanted. And then she went to bed in a single room, and let the rest of the fortune sit in the rooms with the curtains drawn. In 1991, when she was 84 years old, she developed a series of skin lesions on her face. The doctor she had used for decades was no longer practicing. A new physician, Dr. Henry Singman, was recommended to her by an acquaintance. He came to the apartment, examined her, and concluded that the lesions required hospital evaluation. She agreed to go in. She did not pack to come back. Chapter 6. 20 years. At the hospital, she never left. In 1991, at age 84 and in no urgent medical need, Huguette Clark checked into Beth Israel Medical Center, and she would not leave alive. The hospital was a teaching hospital, affiliated with what was then the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. It was located on 1st Avenue at 16th Street in Manhattan, a long taxi ride from her apartment at 907 5th Avenue. She was admitted under Dr. Singman's care for what was initially described as the evaluation and treatment of a skin condition. The skin condition was treated relatively quickly. She did not leave. Within months, what had been intended as a short hospital stay had quietly become her residence. She was given a private room on a quiet floor. She had her own staff. She had her telephone. She had, eventually, a small collection of antique French dolls she had asked to be brought from the apartment. The hospital did not formally discharge her, and she did not formally refuse to leave. She simply remained. Hadassah Peri was hired as her private nurse in 1991. Peri was a Filipino immigrant who had been working as a registered nurse at Doctor's Hospital, where Huguette had been briefly seen during the initial evaluation. Peri came to Beth Israel with her. She would remain at Huguette's bedside for the next 20 years, working 12-hour shifts, 6 and 7 days a week, for the rest of Huguette's life. Huguette grew to depend on her completely. By every account from people who visited the hospital room, the relationship was warm, attentive, and possessive on both sides. Across the next 2 decades, by various probate court findings and accounts subsequently published in the New York Times and elsewhere, Hadassah Peri received from Huguette Clark direct cash gifts, real estate, vehicles, jewelry, educational expenses, and medical expenses totaling more than $31 million. The gifts included a stipend that became, in the later years, the equivalent of a salary for a senior corporate executive. They included houses for Peri's children. They included a Stradivarius violin valued at over $1 million that Huguette gave Peri's daughter, who was studying music. They included a series of cars and a regular allowance for Peri's husband. By the standards of any independent fiduciary review, the transfers were extraordinary. By the standards of the room they took place in, they were the natural consequence of 2 decades of round-the-clock care. Dr. Henry Singman received, across the 2 decades, payments and gifts totaling approximately $800,000 in addition to ordinary professional fees. The gifts included real estate, vehicles, and substantial cash sums for his children's education. Singman was, by every available account, a kind man who had crossed a structural line he himself probably did not see clearly. He visited Huguette regularly, sometimes daily, and the visits were experienced by Huguette as personal friendship. Beth Israel Medical Center, the institutional beneficiary, received gifts from Huguette across the years, totaling at least $4 million. The gifts included substantial unrestricted donations that the hospital used for capital projects. The hospital's then president, Dr. Robert Newman, personally visited Huguette in her room on a number of occasions and accepted gifts on behalf of the institution. The hospital was, throughout the period, presenting itself to potential larger donors as having a unique private endowment relationship with a major Manhattan heiress. Her attorney, Wallace Bach, who had inherited the relationship from his predecessor at the same firm, was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees during the period and oversaw the gift documentation. Her accountant, Irving Kamsler, similarly received substantial professional payments while administering the gift program. Kamsler would later, in a separate matter, plead guilty in 2008 to attempted disseminating of indecent material to minors and would receive probation. Bach would later face questions over a Jewish heritage land transaction in Israel involving funds from Huguette's accounts. Neither would face criminal charges related to the gifts themselves. In 1999, Huguette signed 2 wills 6 weeks apart. The first will, dated March 7th, was drafted by Wallace Bach and divided her estate primarily among the descendants of her father's first marriage, who were also Huguette's surviving relatives. The second will, dated April 19th, was drafted by Bach and Kamsler and redirected the great majority of the estate away from the relatives and toward a newly created Bellosguardo foundation. Her nurse, Hadassah Peri, her goddaughter Wanda Steika, who was the daughter of her painting teacher Tadeusz Steika, Beth Israel Medical Center, and Bach and Kamsler themselves as compensated executors. The second will name no Clark relative as a major beneficiary. The 6 weeks between the 2 wills have never been satisfactorily explained. The lawyers said Huguette had reconsidered her priorities. The relatives later said Huguette had been pressured by the people in the room with her, the people who would receive the redirected funds. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which would open an investigation after her death, never indicted anyone. The investigation concluded without criminal charges, but did refer the matter to the Manhattan Surrogates Court, which is the New York court that handles probate disputes. The hospital, the lawyer, the accountant, the nurse, the doctor, the institutional beneficiaries all received what they received, because the architecture of inherited wealth in the United States, even at the end of the 20th century, did not adequately protect a woman in her 80s or 90s from the slow, normal pressure of the people who spent every day in her room. Each gift, taken individually, looked like generosity. Aggregated across 20 years, the gifts looked like a quietly executed transfer of an enormous fortune from one woman who could no longer leave her bed to the people who controlled access to the door. She died on May 24, 2011, 2 weeks before her 105th birthday. She had lived in the hospital for 20 years. She had been worth, at the start of those 20 years, somewhere around $300 million. She had been worth, at her death, somewhere around $300 million still. The fortune was largely intact. The architecture of who would receive it, however, had been rebuilt entirely while she lay in the bed. Her hospital room had quietly become the private vault from which the rest of her life withdrew. Chapter 7. The Will and the Estate Battle. When she died at 104, the relatives she had not seen in decades arrived in court, and so did the nurse who had been with her every day. The probate began in the summer of 2011 in the Manhattan Surrogates Court. The first will, the one favoring the Clark relatives, had been superseded by the second will, the one favoring Peri and the hospital and the new foundation. The relatives challenged the second will. They argued undue influence, lack of capacity, and a long pattern of isolation that had cut Huguette off from independent counsel for years. The case never reached a verdict. It settled in September 2013 after months of negotiation. The settlement, approved by the Surrogates Court, redistributed substantial portions of the estate. The Clark relatives, 19 of them across the descendant lines from William Clark's first marriage, received a combined approximately $34 million. Hadassah Peri kept a substantial portion of the gifts she had received during Huguette's lifetime, but the settlement required her to forfeit additional amounts and gave back approximately $34 million to the estate for redistribution. The Bellosguardo Foundation was preserved and received the Santa Barbara estate. Beth Israel kept the $4 million in gifts it had received during Huguette's lifetime. Dr. Singman kept the gifts he had received. Bach and Kamsler were removed as executors, but retained the fees they had already collected. The court found, in approving the settlement, that the architecture of the gifts during life had been structurally suspicious, but had also, in many cases, been legally documented well enough that the estate could not effectively claw them back. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which had opened an elder abuse investigation in 2010 while Huguette was still alive, formally closed the criminal inquiry in 2013 without filing charges against any of the parties. The district attorney issued a public statement saying the office had been unable to find provable criminal conduct, while noting that the financial conduct it had reviewed had raised significant questions. The estate then attempted to claw back $4 million in gifts that had gone to Beth Israel itself, arguing that the hospital had improperly influenced Huguette while she was a patient under its care. The Manhattan Surrogates Court Judge Nora Anderson ruled in 2015 that the statute of limitations had expired on those claims. The hospital kept the $4 million. The public administrator's office, which had been administering the estate during the probate dispute, accepted the ruling. The numbers across the entire arc were, looked at coldly, extraordinary. During her lifetime, Huguette had given gifts totaling approximately $40 million to people in her hospital room and the institutions around it. After her death, the estate had recovered roughly $34 million of that, largely from Peri, and had failed to recover the rest. The Clark relatives, against whom she had effectively been turned by the second will, received approximately $34 million in the settlement, a substantial figure, but a small fraction of the estate she had inherited from her father almost 90 years earlier. The Bellosguardo Foundation today operates the estate as a private cultural institution. It opens occasionally for guided tours. The miniature buildings and the doll collection were partially sold at Sotheby's in 2014 and 2017, raising tens of millions of dollars that flowed into the estate. The Fifth Avenue apartment sold in stages between 2013 and 2015 for prices that, in aggregate, approached $30 million. The The Le Beau Chateau property in New Canaan, never used by Huguette, sold in 2014 for $15 million to a private buyer. What the courts could not adjudicate was whether the architecture had failed her. The architecture had not failed. The architecture had functioned as designed. A woman whose father had been one of the most ruthless capitalists in American history had become, by the end of her own life, the channel through which the great Clark copper fortune was redirected to a nurse, a hospital, a lawyer, an accountant, a foundation, and a dispersed group of relatives she had never been close to. The fortune itself had survived more or less intact. It simply now belonged to other people. The gifts she made were judged legal. The architecture had performed exactly as designed. The heiress was simply the place the money passed through. This is the central irony of the Huguette Clark story, and it is the structural truth that the next case study in this anthology will demonstrate in a third and final form. Chapter 8. The Custody Trial of the Century. She was 10 years old when two grown women fought in a Manhattan courtroom for the right to spend her trust fund. Gloria Laura Vanderbilt was born on February 20th, 1924 in New York. Her father was Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, great-grandson of the Commodore, the founder of the Vanderbilt family fortune. Reginald was, by every available account, a charming alcoholic who had inherited a substantial trust at 21 and had spent his life dispersing it through bad investments, prolonged drinking, and a divorce settlement to his first wife. He died on September 4th, 1925, when Gloria was 15 months old. He was 45 years old. The official cause was a hemorrhage of the esophagus caused by long-term alcoholism. He left two daughters from two marriages. Gloria, the youngest, inherited one half of his remaining $5 million trust. The principle, in the structure of the Vanderbilt family trust law that had been written by Reginald's grandfather a generation earlier, could not be touched by Gloria until she turned 21. The interest, however, paid out at approximately $4,000 per month, which in 1925 was a substantial salary for a man in any profession, and which is the equivalent of approximately $70,000 per month in modern currency. The interest stream was the resource the family would fight over because the family had access to no other significant Vanderbilt income. Gloria's mother was Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, Reginald's second wife. She had been 20 when she married him, 21 when she had Gloria, and 22 when he died. She had grown up partly in Europe and partly in the United States, was the daughter of an American diplomat, and was now a young widow with a child and a controlled access to a substantial monthly interest payment. She moved between Paris, New York, and the French Riviera with her twin sister Thelma. The two sisters became fixtures of the international party set of the late 1920s and early 1930s. Gloria the child was raised primarily by a nanny named Emma Sullivan Keislich, whom she would later call by the nickname Dodo, and whom she loved unreservedly. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was Reginald's sister. She was the founder of what would become the Whitney Museum of American Art. She had married Harry Payne Whitney in 1896 and had access to her own substantial Vanderbilt and Whitney trust income. She was 30 years older than her sister-in-law, a serious sculptor in her own right, and a person of considerable social authority. She believed her sister-in-law Gloria Morgan was an unfit guardian for the child, was raising the child poorly, and was misusing the trust income. In 1934, when Gloria the child was 10 years old, Gertrude Whitney sued Gloria Morgan in Manhattan Supreme Court for custody and for trustee control over the trust. The trial began in September. It ran for 7 weeks. The transcripts were reported daily on the front pages of every major American newspaper. The press called it the trial of the century, a label that would later be reused for several other cases, but which originated in this courtroom. The testimony included accusations that Gloria Morgan had been involved in lesbian affairs with various aristocratic European women, including a Lady Milford Haven, who would later become a confidant of European royalty. The testimony included accusations of neglect, including assertions that Gloria Morgan left the child for weeks at a time with the nanny while traveling. The testimony included financial accounting of the $4,000 monthly interest payments and where each month's payment had gone. The most explosive testimony was given by the nanny, Dodo, who described the mother as absent, the household as chaotic, and the child as effectively raised by staff alone. 10-year-old Gloria sat through significant portions of the trial, She was photographed entering and leaving the courthouse with one or another adult holding her hand. The press, in 1934, had no compunction about photographing children in public legal proceedings. She was on the front page of newspapers in 8 states, in tears, sitting on a wooden bench outside a courtroom, holding a doll the press would later identify by name. The verdict, delivered November 21, 1934, awarded custody primarily to Gertrude Whitney. Gloria Morgan was given limited visitation. The trust was placed under the management of professional trustees. The child went to live at her aunt's Long Island estate at Old Westbury and at her aunt's Manhattan townhouse. Her mother was, for several years, effectively shut out of her daily life. The press, having watched the trial for 7 weeks, now had a complete cast of villains and a single victim. Gloria the child was the victim. The press named her Poor Little Rich Girl. The name stuck. It would follow her for the rest of her life. She wrote later, in her own books, that the trial had taught her 3 things at the age of 10. First, that adults would discuss her money in front of her without apology. Second, that the people around her would form alliances and break them based on access to that money. Third, that the only person she could ever truly trust to be on her own side, in any room, in any conversation, in any decision, was herself. The first 2 lessons would be confirmed repeatedly across her life. The third lesson, the one she most needed, would prove to be the hardest one to actually apply. She inherited, in the same year as the custody verdict, an additional $880,000 from her paternal grandmother, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, who died in 1934, shortly before the trial ended. The Principal Vanderbilt Trust paid out fully to Gloria on her 21st birthday in February 1945. She was, at 21, in nominal control of her own money for the first time. She had also by then been married for 3.5 years. Chapter 9. The 4 Marriages and the Self-Invented Career. At 17, she married a man twice her age who reportedly beat her, and that was only the first attempt to find someone the family would not control. Her first husband was Pasquale John DiCicco, known professionally as Pat DiCicco. He was 32 years old. He was a Hollywood agent and a friend of the actor Cary Grant. He had connections in the studios and connections, less reputably, on the periphery of New York and Los Angeles organized crime. He had been previously married to the actress Thelma Todd, who had died in 1935 under circumstances that had been ruled accidental, but had also produced ongoing rumor and police speculation across the rest of his life. Gloria married DiCicco in December 1941 at the Santa Barbara estate of his friend Errol Flynn. She was 17. She was, by her own later account, escaping the family that had won custody of her, the aunt who had raised her, and the public identity as Poor Little Rich Girl. She believed briefly that being married meant being a person rather than a sum. The marriage lasted 3 years. DiCicco was, by Gloria's own published account decades later, physically abusive. She filed for divorce in 1945, the same year the trust principal devolved to her. Her second husband, Leopold Stokowski, was 63 years old when she married him in April 1945. He was the celebrated conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra and one of the most internationally famous musicians of the 20th century. Gloria was 21. She believed again that she had escaped the family. The Stokowski marriage produced 2 sons, Leopold Stanislaus Stokowski and Christopher Stokowski. It lasted 10 years. Her third husband, the director Sidney Lumet, married her in 1956. He was 32 years old to her 31. The marriage produced no children and lasted 7 years. Lumet later directed 12 Angry Men, Network, and Dog Day Afternoon. He and Gloria remained friendly after their divorce. Her fourth and final husband, the author Wyatt Cooper, married her in 1963. He was 36 to her 39. He was, by every account from those who knew them both, the one she had been looking for. He was kind. He was steady. He shared her interest in art and literature. He did not need her money. He had 2 sons with her, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, born in 1965, and Anderson Hayes Cooper, born in 1967. He died unexpectedly in 1978 during routine cardiac surgery. He was 50. His death almost destroyed her. She wrote later that she had finally found a partner she could actually be married to, and the partner had been removed from her by something as random as a routine medical procedure. She was 54. She was now a single mother with 2 young sons. She had been working in parallel the entire time. She had been an actress in television in the 1950s. She had been an artist with serious exhibitions of her oil paintings at the Hammer Galleries in New York in the early 1960s. She had written several books. She had developed a sense for interior design and for decorative goods. In the mid-1970s, she began the project that would define her financially for the rest of her life. She launched a denim and apparel line under her own name. The denim, with the famous embroidered swan logo at the back pocket, became one of the breakthrough fashion products of the late 1970s. The Gloria Vanderbilt brand was sold first through Mortimer Rosenfeld at the licensing company Merjani International. By 1979, the brand was producing over $150 million per year in wholesale revenue. By 1980, Gloria herself was earning, by various estimates, somewhere between $10 and $12 million per year in royalties. She built a Manhattan townhouse at 13 Gracie Square on the Upper East Side. She filled it with her own art and decorative objects. She wrote her autobiography, Once Upon a Time, published in 1985, the first of several memoirs. She gave interviews. She accepted with a degree of self-knowledge the public identity that the press had given her at 10, and she rebuilt it as a brand. For roughly a decade, from 1977 through 1987, Gloria Vanderbilt was an entirely self-made woman of substantial means. The Vanderbilt Trust had largely been spent. The Whitney Trust had not. The denim royalties were her own. She paid her own taxes from her own earnings. She bought her own homes with her own money. She was, briefly, the version of herself she had wanted to be at 10 in the courtroom in Manhattan. She had reclaimed her name and her income, and for that decade she lived inside both of them. She did not know yet, at the peak of the denim years, that the people she had hired to manage her affairs were about to take both away from her. Chapter 10. The Lawyer Who Drained Her Trust. She signed the document because she trusted them, and they used it to take what she had built. The document was a comprehensive power of attorney. The people she had signed it for were her attorney, Thomas Andrews, and her psychiatrist, Christ Zois. The relationship with each had developed across years of professional engagement. Andrews managed her financial affairs. Zois had been treating her since the death of Wyatt Cooper in 1978, and the long depression that had followed. The relationship had moved from clinical to personal across a period that Gloria, in her later legal complaint, would describe as one of professional manipulation. The power of attorney granted Andrews and Zois substantial unilateral authority over her bank accounts, her business affairs, and her real estate. Gloria signed it in the late 1980s. She trusted them. She had no independent counsel reviewing the document. She did not have a parallel advisor, an outside accountant, or a family member empowered to monitor what the 2 men with the power of attorney were doing. Across the late 1980s and early 1990s, Andrews and Zois used the authority granted to them under the document to make a series of transactions that Gloria did not authorize personally. They sold assets. They reallocated bank accounts. They borrowed against properties. They paid themselves fees and arranged for transactions to companies in which one or both of them held undisclosed interests. The diversions, when she eventually documented them, totaled in the millions of dollars. In 1993, Gloria filed a lawsuit against Andrews and Zois in New York Supreme Court. She accused them of breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, conversion, and professional malpractice. The lawsuit was reported in the press. It was the first time Gloria had publicly accused anyone of fraud against her. She was 69 years old. The case proceeded slowly. Andrews and Zois denied the allegations. Both men eventually faced sanctions from their respective professional boards. The court found in Gloria's favor in 1995 and awarded her $1.79 million. She did not collect the judgment in full. Andrews had moved assets and structured his finances in ways that made enforcement difficult. Gloria ultimately collected, by her own published account and interviews, approximately $300,000 from a New York State Victims of Fraud fund. The remainder of the judgment was never paid. In parallel, the Internal Revenue Service had filed liens against her for unpaid back taxes. The Andrews diversions had left her unable to make required payments. The denim royalties, which had peaked in the early 1980s, had collapsed by the early 1990s as the brand lost its market share to younger labels. The combination of reduced income and diverted assets left her, in her late 60s, in a financial position she had not occupied since the immediate aftermath of her divorce from DeCicco in 1945. She sold properties to meet the IRS demand. The Southampton house went first. The townhouse at 13 Gracie Square was eventually sold as well. She gave interviews acknowledging her situation. She told the writer, Wendy Goodman, in a profile that ran in House and Garden, that she had been quietly close to bankruptcy in the mid-1990s. Anderson Cooper, then a young correspondent at Channel One and later at ABC News, eventually intervened with personal advice and emotional support, though he was 27 and had no power of attorney to fix the underlying problem. The structural recognition by the late 1990s was the third version of the same recognition this documentary has carried through Barbara Hutton and Huguette Clark. Gloria Vanderbilt had not been defeated by personal extravagance. She had not been undone by failed marriages, although she had had several. She had been drained by the people inside the room with her, the people who had unilateral access to her accounts, the people whose income depended on her continued cooperation, the people who had no independent fiduciary check on their conduct. The architecture, again, had not failed her. The architecture had functioned exactly as designed. For the third time in this documentary, the failure was not personal. It was systemic. Chapter 11. The son who inherited almost nothing. When she died in 2019, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Commodore Vanderbilt left her son $1.5 million and a name worth more than any sum. Gloria Laura Vanderbilt died on June 17, 2019, at her apartment in Manhattan. She was 95. The cause was stomach cancer. She had been ill quietly for several months. Her surviving son, Anderson Cooper, by then an established journalist and anchor at CNN, was at her bedside. Her estate was estimated at the time of her death at approximately $1.5 million. The vast majority of it passed to Anderson under her will. Her elder Stokowski son, Leopold Stanislaus Stokowski, and her other Cooper son, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, were each addressed separately. Carter had died in 1988 at age 23 by suicide in front of his mother on the terrace of her 14th floor New York apartment. The trauma of that loss had shadowed her entire later life. The other Stokowski son, Christopher, had been estranged for many years. Anderson, in interviews after his mother's death, and in his subsequent book, Vanderbilt, The Rise and Fall of an American Dynasty, published in 2021 with the historian Catherine Howe, was explicit about both the financial reality and the philosophical inheritance. His mother had told him, in conversations across the previous decade, that there was no trust fund. He had said publicly, in a 2014 interview with Howard Stern, that her position on inheritance was that an inheritance was an initiative-crushing curse. He had agreed with her. He had built his own career independently from any expectation of family money. The estate of $1.5 million was, by any normal American standard, a substantial inheritance. By the standard of the Vanderbilt family, it represented the visible endpoint of a 170-year arc that had begun with the Commodore in the early 1830s. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the original Commodore, had died in 1877, leaving an estate estimated at $105 million in 1877 currency, the equivalent of well over $3 billion in modern terms, and the largest individual private fortune in the United States at that moment. His son, William Henry Vanderbilt, had doubled it by his own death in 1885. By the early 20th century, the fortune had been divided across multiple branches. The most famous mansions of Fifth Avenue and Newport had been built, the yachts had been built, the art collections had been assembled, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Commodore had married European nobility, founded museums, lost money in failed banks, given fortunes to charity, drunk themselves to death, married for love, married for status, and, generation by generation, dispersed the original fortune through the dozens of channels that a vast family with no productive new income inevitably creates. By 1973, when Fortune magazine published its survey of America's wealthiest individuals, no living Vanderbilt appeared on the list. The Forbes 400, when it was launched in 1982, contained no Vanderbilt. The Forbes 400 has never, in any year since, contained a Vanderbilt. the largest private fortune in the United States at the height of the American Gilded Age, had, across roughly 100 years, ceased to exist as a recognizable family fortune at all. Gloria, the great-great-great-granddaughter of the Commodore and the most famous Vanderbilt of the 20th century, was the final witness rather than the final inheritor. She had been the channel through which the last few drops of the original Vanderbilt fortune passed into history. The $1.5 million she left her son was real money. It was not, in any historical sense, Vanderbilt money. The Vanderbilt money was gone. Anderson Cooper has been candid about what the gone money means. He has said publicly that he is, in some sense, the first member of his line, on his mother's side, who has had to make his own living from his own earnings. He has called this fact a freedom. He has also acknowledged that it is, at the same time, the public ending of a story that 150 years ago seems structurally permanent. The name has survived, the money has not. And the great-great-great-granddaughter of the Commodore, in the final decades of her life, had become the living monument to a structural pattern that this documentary has now followed through 3 women across 100 years of American capitalism. Chapter 12. What the vault was actually for. 3 women, $2 billion at peak, and 3 deaths that resolved exactly nothing about where any of it actually went. Barbara Hutton, Huguette Clark, Gloria Vanderbilt. They were born 13 years and 1 country apart. They lived through different decades of the American century. They had different husbands and different marriages and different illnesses and different versions of withdrawal. They were not, in any obvious sense, the same story. And yet they were the same story. Each of them inherited a fortune that, in the language the country used at the time, made her one of the wealthiest women alive. Each of them was surrounded, for the active portion of her adult life, by trusted men whose income depended on her continued cooperation. Each of them died functionally without the fortune she had inherited. Each of them was described by the press at the time of her death and by the surface biographers afterward as the architect of her own undoing. The verbs the press used were wrong. Barbara Hutton did not waste her fortune. Her fortune was extracted from her in carefully negotiated installments by 6 husbands, a long-serving lawyer, and a constellation of personal staff whose presence depended on the continuing presence of the money. Huguette Clark did not give her fortune away. Her fortune was redirected in carefully documented gifts by the people who controlled access to her hospital room, while she lay in a bed she could not leave. Gloria Vanderbilt was not simply robbed by a single bad lawyer. Her fortune, both inherited and self-made, was eroded by the structural reality that the power of attorney she signed was a document she had no parallel advisor to police. When we say that Barbara wasted, or that Huguette gave, or that Gloria was robbed, we are letting the architecture off the hook. The architecture was the story. The names were the case studies. Each of these women was, in the strictest legal sense, rich. None of them was free. Each of these women was treated by the structure of American inheritance law and American social practice and American professional retainer economics as the temporary housing of capital in transit. The capital was meant to flow through her on its way to husbands, lawyers, charities, hospitals, and family branches that were structurally entitled to it the moment she let go of it. The system did not want her to keep it. The system did not pretend to want her to keep it. The system was designed, across 100 years, to extract the fortune from women like her, and the system performed exactly as designed. We have spent this documentary watching one structural pattern repeat in 3 different lives, and the pattern is now visible. Inherited wealth without independent authority is not wealth. It is exposure. It is the most beautiful kind of cage ever built. The cage is gold. The cage is engraved with your name. The cage was carved by hands you trusted. The cage is a vault, and on the door of the vault is a sign that says, "This is yours." And inside the vault are all the keys, and every single key belongs to someone else. Every woman who signs her own name on her own behalf. Every woman who reads her own contract. Every woman who keeps a parallel advisor the day she signs a power of attorney. Every woman who refuses to let one professional, one spouse, one nurse, one trustee, one doctor become the only person in the room with her money. Every woman who keeps her own surname in the deed. Every woman who writes her own will in the daylight. Every one of them is the answer to Barbara Hutton and to Huguette Clark and to Gloria Vanderbilt. What do we owe these women? We owe them the truthful verbs. We owe them the recognition that they were not the architects of their own poverty. We owe them the structural account of who took what, when, and by what right. We owe them the refusal to look away, in their lives or in the lives of the women who will inherit fortunes in our own century, from the people who are already in the room and already waiting. The vault has your name on the door. It always did. The keys are the question. 3 women learned that, in 3 different ways, across 100 years. We do not have to learn it the same way. If this story stayed with you, the channel exists exactly to keep telling the ones the society columns wanted forgotten. Subscribe so the next investigation arrives the day it lands. And tell me below, of these 3 women, whose ending hurt the most to sit with, and which of them, given a single difference in the room around her, do you think might have walked out of her own life with the fortune still in her hands?